What if we used this, they were children, some barely old enough to understand the world around them. They had hopes, dreams, and lives that should have stretched far into the future, but instead they found themselves caught in a justice system that showed no mercy. Imagine being only 10 years old, standing in a courtroom, not fully knowing the weight of the words being spoken, words that would decide your fate forever. For these children, the harsh reality of their circumstances ended in ways no child should ever experience. Their final words were not cries for help, but words filled with pain, regret, and sometimes defiance. Words spoken in moments of unimaginable fear and heartbreak. They weren't just words. They were the last pieces of themselves they could share with the world. Who were they? How did their lives lead to such tragic ends? And why do their stories still haunt us today?
Throughout history, the justice system has been a place where lives are judged and decisions made, often with consequences that cannot be undone. In moments where fairness seemed out of reach, children found themselves facing punishments far beyond their comprehension. A child, young and unprepared, standing accused in a courtroom is a scene that forces us to confront difficult questions. Innocence and guilt often seemed blurred, and the outcomes were irreversible. These stories focus on the events, the people, the decisions made, and a system that sometimes failed those who needed protection the most. We witness the collision of right and wrong, fairness and injustice, and the fragile balance of life caught in the crossfire. These events challenge us to understand how young lives could end so tragically, and whether the system that judged them was ever truly fair. In 1944, George Stinney Jr., just 14 years old, became the youngest person to be executed in the United States during the 20th century. George lived in a small, segregated town in South Carolina, a place where the color of your skin often determined the value of your life. For George, growing up poor and African American in a deeply divided community meant facing hardships far beyond his years. But no one could have imagined the nightmare that would unfold. It began with the tragic deaths of two young girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. Their bodies were discovered in a ditch near George's home, and the community quickly demanded justice. In the rush to find someone to blame, authorities focused on George. He was arrested and questioned without an attorney or his parents present, and soon after, he was accused of the crime. What followed was a trial that can only be described as heartbreaking. The courtroom was filled with tension, and George sat alone at the defense table, too young to truly understand the weight of what was happening. His trial lasted less than a day, with no substantial evidence presented on his behalf. His defense attorney barely spoke, and the all-white jury deliberated for just 10 minutes before finding him guilty. In that brief moment, George was led to the electric chair. Barely big enough to fit into the chair, he had to sit on a Bible to reach the straps. As he looked at the witnesses gathered, he maintained his innocence, saying, "I didn't do it." Those would be his last words. Decades later, new evidence came to light. Evidence that George's confession was likely coerced, and that he had been wrongfully convicted. His case has since become a symbol of the deep flaws in the justice system, especially during the time when racial prejudice played such a powerful role in determining guilt and innocence. But for George, that realization came too late. His life was taken, and the truth, though revealed years later, could never bring him back. James Arene's story is one of the most tragic examples of a young life forever shaped by a relentless and unforgiving justice system. He was just 10 years old, still a child, when he was manipulated into committing a robbery alongside an older accomplice. He may not have fully understood what he was being forced into, but his actions that day would lead to consequences far beyond anything a child should ever face. James was a Native American boy living in a time of great upheaval and injustice. During the late 19th century, the world around him was changing rapidly, and Native American communities often bore the brunt of those changes. Displacement, poverty, and systemic prejudice were everyday realities. James, like so many others of his background, was left to struggle against a world that seemed determined to push him to the margins. The crime itself was a robbery that turned deadly. Alongside his older accomplice, James entered a shop with the intent to steal, but when things went wrong, the shopkeeper was killed. James fled, trying to escape the consequences of what had happened. But even running couldn't save him. He was eventually captured years later and brought to trial. His trial raised serious questions about fairness and ethics. By the time he stood before the court, he was no longer the 10-year-old boy who had committed the crime. 13 years had passed. James was now a young man, but the system still treated him as though time hadn't changed anything. The court convicted him, and his sentence was death. As James faced his final moments, he reportedly said, "Tell my people I was brave." In those words, there was both defiance and acceptance. It was a declaration of courage in the face of an impossible situation, a message to his people that even in the darkest moments, dignity could not be taken away. But the questions surrounding James Arene's case have never truly gone away. Should a 10-year-old child forced into a crime have faced such severe consequences? Was justice served, or was James a victim of a system that cared more about punishment than fairness? The delay in his trial and the conditions of his execution highlight the deep flaws in his system that failed to see him for what he was, a child, forced into circumstances he couldn't control. James's story leaves us with a heavy truth. His life was marked by tragedy, and his death was shaped by decisions that reflect a time of deep injustice. Yet, his courage in the face of it all remains unforgettable, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of overwhelming odds. Lena Baker's story is one of struggle, survival, and ultimately tragedy. She was a mother, a daughter, and a caretaker, living in 1940s Georgia, a time and place where the weight of prejudice and inequality was often unbearable. Her life was shaped by poverty and the harsh realities of being a poor African-American woman in a deeply segregated society. But it was her death that would make history and force a reckoning with the justice system. Lena worked as a caretaker for a white man named Ernest Knight, who was known for his abusive and controlling behavior. Their working relationship quickly became a source of tension and fear. In 1944, during an altercation that escalated beyond her control, Lena claimed it was self-defense, that she had no choice but to protect herself in the face of danger. But her words were not enough to save her. The justice system of the time offered little protection or understanding for women like Lena. Her trial lasted just a single day. The jury, all white and all male, deliberated for only a short time before delivering their verdict, guilty of murder. Her sentence was death by electrocution. As Lena faced her final moments, she stood with a dignity that belied the injustice she had endured. Her final words were powerful and haunting. She said, "What I did in self-defense. God knows the truth." Those words carry the weight of a woman who knew the odds were stacked against her, but who refused to let her voice go unheard. Years later, Lena's story would take on new meaning. In 2005, the state of Georgia issued her a posthumous pardon, acknowledging that her execution was a tragic miscarriage of justice. While it came too late to save her, it served as a reminder of the failures of a system that too often ignored the voices of women, the poor, and the marginalized. Lena Baker's life and death highlight the intersecting struggles of race, gender, and justice. Her story is a stark reminder of how the scales of justice can tip unfairly, especially in times of deep societal prejudice. But her courage and her final words remain etched in history, a testament to her strength in the face of unimaginable injustice. In 2004, Cyntoia Brown's story captured the nation's attention. She was just 16 years old, a child caught in the devastating cycle of abuse and exploitation. Her life up to that point had been anything but stable. Born into a world of struggle, she faced challenges that no one, especially someone so young, should ever have to endure. By the time she was a teenager, she had been trafficked and was living under the control of a man who exploited her for his own gain. Of course, we can only assume that something tragic was actually going on in that courtyard behind White Allen's garage. The night Cyntoia was solicited by a 43-year-old man, Johnny Allen. She later said that she feared for her life during their encounter, feeling trapped and threatened, shooting Allen. The events of that night would change her life forever. When the case went to trial, the courtroom became a battleground for two narratives. Prosecutors painted her as a cold-blooded killer, while Cyntoia and her defense team argued that she was a victim of years of abuse and manipulation. The jury ultimately convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. At just 16, her future was taken away, locked behind the bars of a justice system that many believed had failed to see her as a child who was trying to survive. In court, Cyntoia's words struck a chord with everyone who heard them. She said, "I was just a scared kid trying to protect myself." Those words carried the weight of her truth, of the fear and desperation she had felt in that moment. But they also reflected the larger story of so many others like her, children trapped in cycles of abuse, often unseen and unheard. Her sentencing sparked outrage among advocates for juvenile justice and victims of trafficking. Over the years, public campaigns and legal challenges brought her case back into the spotlight. People from all walks of life rallied around her, sharing her story and calling for a second chance for a young woman who had already endured so much. In 2019, after spending 15 years behind bars, Cyntoia was granted clemency and released from prison. Her story became a symbol of hope, a reminder of the power of advocacy and the importance of seeing beyond the surface of a crime to understand the person behind it. Cyntoia Brown's case is one of tragedy, resilience, and ultimately redemption. Her journey sheds light on the urgent need for a justice system that recognizes the complexity of trauma and abuse, especially for children. Her story challenges us to question how we view justice and mercy, and to ask how many others like her are still waiting for someone to listen, to care, and to fight for their freedom. Final words carry a weight that cannot be ignored. They are the last opportunity for someone to speak their truth, to share their thoughts, or to leave a message behind. For these children, those final moments were filled with words that captured their innocence, their fear, and sometimes their quiet defiance against a world that had turned its back on them. George Stinney Jr., just 14 years old, walked to the electric chair with a courage far beyond his years. His small frame barely fit the chair, and he had to sit on a Bible to reach the straps. Even then, he maintained his innocence, saying softly, "I didn't do it." Those words, so simple yet so powerful, continue to echo through history as a reminder of the deep flaws in a system that failed to reach through the straps. Even then, he maintained his innocence, saying softly, "I didn't do it." Those words, so simple yet so powerful, continue to echo through the landscape of our United States as a country. James Arene, a boy barely more than 10 years old when his life began to spiral out of control, faced the ultimate punishment 13 years later. As he stood before the gallows, he left a message not of anger, but of bravery. "Tell my people I was brave," he said. It was a statement that transcended his tragic circumstances, reflecting the pride and strength of his identity, even as the world around him refused to see it. Lena Baker's final words remain some of the most haunting. As a woman who had endured years of hardship and injustice, she stood with quiet dignity in her final moments. "What I did in self-defense. God knows the truth." Those words carry with them the pain of her struggles, the strength of her conviction, and the heartbreaking reality of a justice system that refused to listen until it was far too late. And then there is Cyntoia Brown, whose story did not end in tragedy, but whose words during her trial carried the same emotional weight. "I was just a scared kid trying to protect myself," she said. In those words, we hear the voice of a child who had been pushed to the edge, forced to make choices no one her age should ever have to face. Her story, while ending in hope, serves as a reminder of how many others never got that chance. These final words remind us of the humanity of those who spoke them. They challenge us to see the people behind the cases, to feel the pain they endured, and to understand the courage it took to speak at all. They are not just words, they are legacies. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truths of a system that has too often failed those it was meant to protect. Each phrase, each moment of bravery, carries a lesson that cannot be ignored. It's a lesson about justice, about compassion, and about the urgent need to ensure that no more lives are lost to such preventable failures. These final words stay with us, not just because of the tragedy they represent, but because of the voices they give to the silenced. And in those voices, we find both heartbreak and the hope for something better. Their stories reveal the cracks in a system that was supposed to protect, but instead chose punishment over understanding. Each story carries lessons we cannot afford to ignore. True justice requires humanity, fairness, and compassion. Without these, the system becomes cold and unforgiving, leaving behind lives that could have been saved. George Stinney Jr., James Arene, Lena Baker, and Cyntoia Brown each faced moments that no child or young person should ever experience. Their final words remind us of the strength it takes to hold on to hope, even when hope feels impossible. But they also remind us of the cost of getting it wrong. For some, like Lena and George, the price was their lives. For others, like James, it was the dignity stolen in their final moments. And for Cyntoia, it was years lost that could never be returned. Do you believe the system failed them? Or do you see these cases differently? Their stories challenge us to consider what justice really means and how we can ensure fairness for those who need it most. These voices deserve to be heard. Their stories deserve to be remembered, and their lives demand that we do better. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in keeping these conversations alive. And if these stories moved you, consider subscribing for more. Together, we can shine a light on the stories that too often go untold, and we can ensure that these memories are never forgotten.